Hi and welcome everyone. This is the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series, and this is our second event in the Michaelmas term. My name is Raphael Fazol, and I am the co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. I see a few new names here in the meeting, so I'm going to say a few words about how the Talking Animals series works. After this introduction, we will be listening to our speaker who will talk to us for about 30 to 45 minutes, and we'll then have a discussion together afterwards. Everyone's warmly invited to participate in the discussion. You can ask questions you might have for our speaker. You can raise any comments. Please do so if you can by using the raise hand function. You will find that under the React button on the bottom of your Zoom app. It's the little heart icon if you've recently updated your Zoom. If it's a bit difficult for you to share your video or microphone, you can also pop your question or comment into the chat. I will have all the microphones on mute until we reach the discussion bit. And as you may have seen, we are recording this presentation. So if you have to leave early or if you want to share this with a friend, the video will be uploaded to our YouTube channel and our website in a couple of days' time. Brilliant. So with that out of the way, it is now my great pleasure to introduce our fantastic speaker today, and that's Professor Kristin Andrews. Professor Andrews holds the York Research Chair in Animal Minds at York University in Canada, where she is also a professor in the philosophy department, and she's also a fellow in the Future Flourishing program, and she's sitting on the board of the Borneo Orangutan Society in Canada. In her research, she combines philosophical and empirical approaches to a whole range of different exciting questions, such as animal consciousness, animal agency, and animal sociality as well. And she's published a range of different books, including The Animal Mind, an introduction to the philosophy of animal cognition, which was published with Routledge. How to Study Animal Minds with Cambridge University Press, as well as the co-author Chimpanzee Writes the Philosopher's Brief, published with Routledge. And she's currently writing on another exciting book project on animal culture and multi-species norms. And in her presentation today, she will in fact be talking to us about this ongoing research project. So without further ado, it's now my pleasure to hand over to our speaker, Professor Andrews.
Thank you so much, Raphael, for that introduction and for the invitation to speak to the community. It's really nice to meet you all. I'm going to just share my screen here, and I hope that now you can see some slides. Yeah, okay, great, very good. All right, so what I want to talk to you about today is an ongoing project that's related to a book I'm working on on animal cultures and animal societies. This project stems from some ongoing research I'd been doing collaboratively with a number of people that I'll start by talking about. And then I'm going to end with some of my new work. So if you've seen me talk before, I hope there's something new for you as well. All right. So over 30 years ago, let me see there we go. Over 30 years ago, the electrified Cold War fence between Czechia and Germany came down. But these red deer continue to respect the border. This isn't something that the deer evolved to do, but it's something they learned to do, and they learned it from us, even though we didn't know we were teaching them. We shared our culture with the deer. Humans have tried in a lot of ways to separate ourselves from other animals. We, over history, have offered lots of answers to the what makes us special question. And one of these answers has a really long history. And this is the idea that non-human individuals have their knowledge and skills and their social structures innately. They're born already with their social structures and their skills. And that humans alone are individual agents who can build culture, who can learn from one another, and can separate themselves from their biology. What we're finding in the last 25 years of science of animal behavior is really shattering that answer to the question of what makes humans special. We have for the last 25 years, we've been gathering a lot of information about animal culture in non-human animal societies. This is stemming with the discovery of macaque potato washing on Kushima Island and the early work of birdsong dialects about 50 years ago. In the late 1990s, scientists started seeing that there are behavioral differences between groups of animals of the same species, and this was called culture. 25 years ago, there was a publication by Andy Whiten and a number of researchers of chimpanzees across different research sites in Africa, where they described a number of different behavioral differences in the same species. So it's not just chimpanzees, though. Chimpanzees were one of the first animals to be identified, but today we're finding evidence of culture in fish and in fruit flies and in bumblebees. And pretty much everywhere we're looking, we're finding evidence of what biologists are calling culture. Now, this is a kind of a shocking change from our previous thinking about animals as being born, having their social structures innately and their skills innately. If they have culture, then we have questions. And in this talk, I'm going to address 3 questions about animal culture. The first question I want to address is, well, what kind of culture? What do you mean by culture? And is animal culture the same as human culture? Because if there's some similarities between animal culture and human cultures, then we're going to really have to delve deeply into other questions about how to live with other non-human animal cultures. So then the other 2 questions that I will be addressing later in the presentation are, well, what kind of groups have cultures? And what can we learn about flourishing with other animals from thinking about their cultures? So I'll spend about the first 2/3 of the talk on this first question. This is a topic I've been working on for quite some time. And then the last 2 questions, I'll spend about 1/3 of the talk on. And this is what continues to be work in progress. So you're getting a sneak peek into what I'm going to be showing in the book. All right, so let's start with this question. What kind of culture? Are fruit flies and bumblebees like humans in the kind of culture that they have, or is there something quite different? There are 2 ways in which we can understand culture, and one is rather thin, and this is the sense of culture that the biologists and comparative cognition researchers have really been interested in. This idea of culture is simply the idea of socially learned patterns of behavior. So it's still quite a break from these old ideas that animals know how to do things innately, right? David Hume said, well, the birds innately know how to build their nests. We found out that that is not true for a lot of bird species. They learn how to build their nests and they get better at it if they've got good demonstrators. So social learning is really key to the behavioral biological understanding of what culture is. But in addition to social learning, there are other elements that are emphasized. So the cultural behaviors are things that are seen in some populations, but not in others. That there are differences in, say, one group of chimpanzees from another group of chimpanzees. But these differences aren't explained ecologically. It's not a difference that is due to not having the right material in the environment, for example. It's also not thought to be genetically based, so we can't explain the differences between the groups in terms of differences in genetics. This is a problem of the definition, because what it does when this criterion is really abided by, it excludes the very possibility of gene culture coevolution in animals. And so I just want to flag that, even though I'm not going to be talking about that in this talk, but we can talk in the Q&A if you'd like. And also what I found is that this kind of thin culture, the culture that the scientists have been identifying, is usually explored in terms of material culture. And so when there are laboratory experiments about social learning in order to figure out the mode of acquisition, how this behavioral pattern came to be, they're introducing things like toolboxes, puzzle boxes, materials for animals to engage with. And so there's quite an emphasis on material culture. So this might all sound a little bit abstract. Let me give you some examples so you know what I'm talking about. So what you see on this slide here are some images of behaviors that have been given as examples of culture in chimpanzees. The large picture you see is called the hand clasp groom. This is a behavior that's seen in Mahale chimpanzees, but not in Gombe chimpanzees. And it was quite surprising. It was quite a surprising discovery when scientists started moving from community to community. Bill McGrew, in fact, said he'd been studying the Gombe chimpanzees with Jane Goodall, and he thought he knew chimpanzees really well. And then he went to Mahale to visit this Japanese research site, and he saw the chimpanzees holding hands while they groomed. And he had never seen that before. And he realized, oh, I don't know chimpanzees. I know the Gombe chimpanzees, but the Mahale chimpanzees are different. Another image you see is of nut cracking. This is a behavior seen in some chimpanzee communities, but not others. And it's lacking in communities even where there are rocks and even where there are nuts. It's not always discovered as a means of getting food. And the third picture you see here is a tradition which spread through a community of captive sanctuary chimpanzees, putting a piece of straw in your ear. So the high-ranking female put a piece of straw in her ear, and before long, all the chimpanzees in the group were copying this behavior. So these are all examples of socially learned behaviors that are distinct to some groups and acquired through social learning. So this is super exciting and super interesting, but it might seem like a little thinner than the sense of culture we have in mind when we are thinking about human culture as something that, right, we have certain commitments to, right? We care about our culture. We worry about losing culture. We try to preserve dying cultures. This seems maybe a little bit different. So there's this other sense of culture that we can talk about and call it thick culture. And I think that there's evidence of thick culture in non-human animals as well. So by thick culture, I'm referring to patterns of behavior that are important to group members and which are maintained through social pressure. This is different from the thin version of culture in one way, in that the thick culture doesn't really emphasize the initial mode of acquisition, that the behavior is socially learned. But what it emphasizes is that the pattern of behavior is socially maintained, that group members have put pressure on one another to follow this pattern. And this, I think this kind of thick culture is where culture becomes a society, and a society that's structured with social norms that give us not just a material culture, but also a social culture, rules about what you ought to do and what you ought not do. So I've been working for some years now on this question of social norms in non-human animals societies, and in the human, so mostly in the human literature, we find a discussion of social norms. It's just recently that people have been talking about social norms in other species. And so when you look for a definition of social norms, you often see anthropocentric kinds of definitions, like this one Dan Kelly gives, where a social norm is an often informal rule that structures human behavior, regulating what is appropriate, required, prohibited, or permitted. Now, I have to say that Dan Kelly, I think, would now take the human out of this definition because he's on a paper on animal social norms with me. But this is reflecting this kind of initial thinking that social norms are human unique, which we see again and again in scientific and philosophical literature even today. Right, so we see this claim in the recent book by Victor Kumar and Richmond Campbell, where they argue that, yes, animals have some behavioral traditions, but it's only humans where you get social norms, and this is the real dividing point. You also see this claim made by people like Michael Tomasello, Joe Henrich, Jonathan Birch, Kim Sterolny. So they have their different arguments, the different reasons for why they think that only humans have social norms. But one of the reasons why these figures disagree with me about social animals having social norms is that they define social norms in a way that kinds of excludes humans, non-human animals to begin with. Often these definitions involve some sort of appeal to the cognitive mechanisms that are involved in human social norms and norm following behavior. And I think that this is premature. And Evan Westra and I argued that in order to really make progress on questions about the cognitive mechanisms involved in social norms, we have to first just identify the behavior. What is the behavior that we have in mind? What is the phenomenon of interest? And so we constructed this idea of a normative regularity. A normative regularity is meant to be a kind of psychologically neutral account of what social norms are, and we simply describe it as a socially maintained pattern of behavioral conformity within a community. Now, key to this is the idea of social maintenance. So what we mean by social maintenance? Well, by social maintenance, we have in mind both responses to violations of norms, violations of, say, patterns of behavior, and also acquiring and supporting others acquiring these patterns of behavior. So these kind of negative social maintenance practices would include things like we might expect: physical violence, third-party kind of punishment when a bystander comes up and maybe beats up or takes away a norm violator. But we also see other sorts of behaviors associated with this kind of negative social maintenance. Faced with someone who violates a behavioral pattern that's typical in that community, other individuals might withhold their cooperation. They might express disapproval. They might ostracize the individual. They might ask for reparations. And if they get them, they might then engage in processes of reconciliation. But norms don't exist just because we punish violators. Norms exist because we reward those who conform, and we give naive individuals opportunities to learn norms. And when somebody's learning a norm, beating them up for not doing it right is not very effective. And that's not how we teach our children. We instead reward norm conformity. So we can think about rewards including everything from a calm touch or pat on the back when you get things right, rewards in terms of partner choice from individuals who are following the norms, friendly behavior to those who follow the norms, increased social status by following norms, and then also being tolerant of naive individuals as they learn the norms. And so one example, you might think, what does a norm look like in non-human animals? One example might be this cross-armed walk that we see in a community of chimpanzees living at the Royal Burger Zoo in the Netherlands. This community has this female-specific behavior called the cross-arm walk, which you can see here. It is not a not very efficient way of walking, you might notice. It slows the animals down. They can't hold as much stuff because they're crossing one arm over the other. So this behavior has no adaptive value. It's costly. There's no functional reason to do it. So when two female chimpanzees, Moni and Erica, were introduced into this community, what happened is that the chimpanzee Moni started to conform to this behavior after 2 days. Erica never conformed to this behavior. So it's an interesting difference in these two animals' decisions or behaviors and whether or not to conform to this. What the researchers then did was do a social network analysis, and they found that Moni was much more integrated into the group than Erica. So this offers some suggestive evidence of social maintenance if Moni gained positive social rewards by conforming to this odd walking behavior. We don't know for sure about the direction of causation in this case, but it's a suggestive example. I'm using this to illustrate what a social norm might look like in a chimpanzee community. And then this is an image of Wiwik, a orangutan researcher, babysitter, who's teaching these two rehabilitant orangutans who are about 3 years old how to process gingers. So you see how closely these orangutans are peering at Wiwik when she's stripping away the leaves in order to get at the root. Just having tolerance and allowing individuals who are naive to watch what you're doing might require a certain amount of self-constraint, right? So if you've ever been working at your computer and somebody peers over your shoulder and it's been annoying, you know that you have to be a little bit tolerant if you're letting a naive individual learn from you while you're engaged in something, maybe, cooking at home. And I think the same is true for adult orangutans who are willing to let some individuals get close to them and watch what they're doing, but not just anybody. So this is all suggestive evidence of social norms in non-human animals, but the search for evidence continues. It's just, as I said, a really new topic of investigation. And in a paper with a number of philosophers, psychologists, and animal cognition researchers, both from the field and the lab, we've come up with ways that we can really continue to explore the range of social norms in non-human animals. But I did say that there's this worry that the critics have, right? So these folks who think that only humans have social norms, and that is that non-human animals don't have the right cognitive capacities. In order to have social norms, you need things like shared intentionality. You need to think of we, that we're doing this together. Or you need to have theory of mind. You need to be able to think about what other animals believe and desire. And that there isn't widespread evidence of this in many species, though we have, I think, quite a bit of evidence of this in chimpanzees at this point. But we don't have wide evidence of this in fruit flies, for example. And others will object that, well, animals aren't really following rules. They're just behaving according to a regularity. But for it to be true rule following, the animals have to follow it for a reason. They have to respect the rule themselves. And I think that both of these sorts of objections, both is anthropofabulating what humans do when we are engaged in social norms and underestimating the kinds of capacities of non-human animals. So let's just briefly look at this claim of shared intentionality and theory of mind needed for human social norms by taking one example of a human social norm. This is proximity norms. So proximity norms are norms about how close we're allowed to stand to one another, depending on the kind of relationship we have. We all know how to do this. The rules differ from culture to culture. In Western Anglophone communities, the positive approach for someone you know only socially is 56 centimeters. Now, you probably didn't know it was 56 centimeters. You could have figured it out by measuring how close you stand to people and feel comfortable. But you didn't have a representation of this rule. You don't think that other people believe that they can only stand 46 centimeters away from you, but you know how to do it. And I think a lot of our social norms are like this, including things like greeting practices. Do you hug? Do you shake hands? Do you touch your heart? Do you kiss on one cheek, two cheeks, or three cheeks? We know how to do this, and it's only salient to us when someone comes into the community from outside and does it wrong, or when we travel somewhere else and these greeting norms are different. The same goes with other sort of quotidian practices like eating, toileting, touching, showing skin, and so on and so forth. So none of these norms appear to involve beliefs about other beliefs in any robust way. Um, but it requires some expectations about what others do, which we know that other species are excellent at. There's excellent evidence that animals are able to coordinate behavior, they're able to work together, they're able to reproduce, are able to run away from predators. They're predicting what others do using other methods. One might worry then that if it's the case that you don't really need to have sophisticated cognitive capacities to have norms, and that you can think of rules in this looser sense, that normative regularities or social norms just become too permissive. There are just too many social norms that exist out there. So, for example, you might worry about these Mormon crickets that I have on this slide. The idea here is that Mormon crickets swarm, and when they swarm, they all move together in a group. So they've got a behavioral regularity. They move forward, they eat what's in front of them, and that behavior is socially maintained because if one individual stops, the individual behind them will eat them. Right? So that is quite a strong socially maintained behavior. And if Mormon crickets also have social norms or normative regularities, then one might worry that things have gone too far. But I think that this is a very illustrative case. It's not an example that we've gone too far. It's a case that makes us realize that social norms are not all the same, and that there are dimensions of social norms that we can describe looking at different aspects of what it is to have a social norm. Some of these aspects have to do with how they are socially maintained through, say, pedagogy and punishment, which we have here as two dimensions in this model. We can also look at the kind of cognitive capacities and psychological features that are involved in different kinds of social norms within species and also between species. And so we can look at different ways of rule following, what supports rule following, different cognitive capacities that support collective action, different kinds of motivation, right? Have I internalized the norm? Am I doing it because I feel like I ought to do it or not? And also behavioral understanding, the extent to which you understand the motivations or think you have theories of the motivations of others. And we see that these profiles are going to look different in Mormon crickets and chimpanzees and 3-year-old human children. But also, if you just did this kind of dimensionality mapping for human norms, you would see different patterns for things like proxemic norms and rules about where you're allowed to let your dog go off leash. So when we ask this question, return to this first big question, what kind of culture do non-human animals have? The answer that I want to propose here and that I've been defending is that many animals have thick cultures with both social and material elements, and that these cultures are not just had by smart animals, but are widely distributed across species. So if we have this idea that there is a culture that really counts as societies, are really structured with social norms, thoughts about the way one ought to act, and that these are important to the individuals who live in them. Again, this has societal implications for us and our ways of thinking about other animals, right? Instead of just thinking about animal rights in terms of individual rights, we might have to start thinking about things like rights for communities. Instead of just preserving biological diversity, maybe we need to start thinking about cultural diversity and preserving that as well. So I think it's quite an interesting new perspective in which we can look at some of the things we've already been working on when it comes to right, thinking differently and better about how to live with non-human animals. So I want to turn to the second question next, and that is that what groups have cultures? So I've already said, we've got chimpanzee troops, we've got elephant herds, we've got bumblebee nests, we've got captive dolphin communities. I think that we can think about these kinds of groups as having cultures. I've focused mostly on chimpanzees so far, but it's not the case that you just are going to see culture in wild animals. You're also going to see socially learned patterns of behavior in captive communities, as we saw in with the cross-armed walk. But it's not only the case that the kinds of groups who have cultures are going to be species specific, even though this has been the focus of the science so far, the focus of the biologists and the comparative psychologists. We also see evidence of culture in multi-species societies, in multi-species bird flocks, in communities of street dogs and humans. We see culture in pet cats and humans, or pet dogs and humans. We also see evidence of culture in the relationship between fishers, dolphins, and the fish that the humans and the dolphins are trying to catch. Likewise, we see evidence of culture among herders, the dogs who work with the herders, the wolves who are the dogs are protecting the goats from. And we see examples of culture in honey guide birds and humans, and the different human cultures who have different calls that elicit cooperative behaviors from different communities of honey guide birds. So it's quite a bit richer than we've been thinking so far when it comes to culture. It's not just a species-specific thing, but it's a cross-species sort of thing. So in captivity, as I mentioned, it's not just in the chimpanzees in the zoo, but we would see differences in, one family with their dogs and another family with their dogs. We're going to see differences in the culture of the Yale monkey lab and other monkey labs in around the world. The Anthony Key Resort Ecotourism and Research Center, where scientists and tourists interact daily with about 20 bottlenose dolphins, is going to look different from other communities of captive dolphins. And this is something I've experienced firsthand working with this community and with Lou Herman's community of 4 captive bottlenose dolphins that he had back in the 80s and 90s. And we see this in multi-species sanctuaries like Vine as well. Because there are traditions and practices that get created in these multi-species groups. So it's also important once we start recognizing that in captivity, we see culture as well, that we have to start challenging this idea of what counts as a normal behavior for a species. So here on this slide are images from Camp Leakey in Borneo, and this is one of the first areas where there was a rehab for orangutans. And these orangutans, well, Anne Russin, my colleague, she said when she first went to Camp Leakey, she said it was like walking into the cantina scene of Star Wars, because the orangutans were just hanging out with the humans, washing clothes, lighting things on fire, stealing things from humans, and paddling down the river in boats, wearing life vests sometimes. And they were part of a human society because that is what they learned to do. Another example comes from street dogs and humans. And this image is from Bangalore in India. India has one of the largest street dog populations at 62 million individuals. And street dog populations are growing worldwide, and there are lots of policy issues that exist in many different ways, and working well in some cases and not so well in others. But as domesticated dogs, street dogs are well adjusted to life among humans. And what we're seeing is preliminary evidence that there are norms that get created between the humans and the dogs in these areas. And an upcoming project I have is to study this and the social norms in Leh, India, between the street dogs and humans. So when we ask which groups have cultures, What we need to keep in mind is that cultures form across species, not just within them. And this is akin to the kind of Will Kymlicka, Sue Donaldson duopolis point that our political societies and structures also include animals. But here I'm arguing that we're actually learning things from one another as well. And in this way, our behaviors are being changed by each other in a way that qualifies as culture in terms of social learning from others in the community. So given that we've got this multi-species societies that have culture in them and potentially also social norms in them, what can we learn, or how can we think differently about flourishing with other animals? And I want to end with three considerations about flourishing well with other animals. One has to do with thoughts about conservation and how to deal with conflicts between humans and non-human animals. The second has to do with cultural heritage and how to expand our thinking, or how we might need to expand our thinking when it comes to cultural heritage and preservation. And the third is about multiculturalism and cultural appropriation, and how that might look different once we see that other animals are also part of the story. So first, just a little bit about conservation. Um, so conservation is, of course, a huge project, and part of this project is starting to realize that non-human animals have culture, that they are socially learning things. And so conservation has been recruiting the idea of animal culture in order to figure out how to, for example, get animals to go through green corridors that protects habit and that connects disparate parts of the habitat, so animals can have a wider genetic diversity when they're mating. But my thinking about conservation and social norms is a little bit different. And that is that when we look at the kinds of conflicts that are existing between humans and non-human animals, things like elephants raiding fruit gardens, and this is across Africa and across Southeast Asia, or monkeys who raid kitchens. How is it that we can think differently about dealing with these sorts of interactions when we think in terms of social norms and a really rich sense of culture? Um, and the first step is really to start identifying what these norms might be. So, for example, in the case of the elephants raiding fruit gardens in Thailand, uh, the work that's being done right now to try to stop this behavior includes things like setting up bee fences or setting off fireworks or loud noises. And this has the effect of making the elephants mad. This is not a form of negotiation. So if you think instead about, okay, what is the rule that the elephants might be following, and what are the farmers doing to help support that rule and make the elephants and the humans together be creating this kind of rule? Can we think about how to change our behavior in a way that would change the animals' behavior and change this kind of rule? And something like this is in fact what happened with Monica the elephant, who was the matriarch of her community and used to lead raids of ration shops in India. Um, she was a hated elephant in this community. But when she got older, she lost her role as matriarch and she left the herd. She was living on her own and started coming into the village. Her behavior was different, and the human behavior in response was different as well. And they were able to negotiate a kind of a peace treaty so that she could just hang out in this village and did not cause harm to non-human animals. We see other forms of possible ways of negotiating when we look at the long-tailed macaque robber bartering behavior. This is a monkey from from Bali who steals objects from human tourists and then brings those objects to the temple guardians and exchanges them for food items. And this kind of economy has been enforced by the humans, like reinforced by the humans who are responding to monkeys' demands for higher value food items, for higher value material goods, consumer goods. So for a hat, you might get a sweet potato, but if you stole someone's phone, I saw a video of a monkey throwing away a sweet potato and waiting for a banana, waiting for something that was much higher value, because they knew that the object was a higher value. So this is an example of where it seems like there's a negotiation going on, but this negotiation might be leading to a ramping up of human-wildlife conflict, because of the way this behavior is being reinforced in the community. You may have heard about work being done on trying to communicate with non-human animals, and this kind of attempt to communicate and using machine learning techniques, decoding animal signals. And one of the ideas here is that if this were to be successful, the hope would be to try to figure out what the animals want. And if we could communicate, perhaps we could understand better why these orcas are ramming boats in European seas and perhaps try to negotiate alternatives. If it's just fun, a fun fad, perhaps we can offer other fun fads for the orcas to engage in that won't be so damaging to human boats. Next, turning to cultural heritage. And this idea is grounded in the observation that cultures are fragile. Unlike biology, they're not something that can be preserved in amber. So if nobody engages in the behavior anymore, then that behavioral pattern is lost. And if you've got a society with a number of different behavioral patterns and that society is gone, you can never get that society back again. This is true even if you attempt these de-extinction projects like Colosso Bioscience is trying to do. They're trying to bring back the woolly mammoth. But when we understand that a woolly mammoth is not just a biological organism, but is a culture, was a society, and we cannot bring back that society. There is no way that we can bring back the woolly mammoth. There is no bringing back the woolly mammoth. There is creating something new, right? If you put this DNA into, say, an elephant and gestate it and raise the offspring with elephants, then you're going to get an animal that's not going to be a woolly mammoth or an elephant or anything else. Because biology is nothing without culture for a cultural animal. And finally, I want to turn to, oh, it's not finally. Yeah, so I want to turn next to protecting cultural diversity in animal cultures, the importance of that, right? So we've lost the culture of the woolly mammoth. So it might in fact be something that we need to start thinking differently about and protect not just species, but protect cultural diversity of species. With the chimpanzees under threat, we are seeing some communities of chimpanzees really, really challenged, really threatened. And those who argue, oh, well, we just have some other chimpanzees here, or we can put some chimpanzees in the zoo and we can save chimpanzees that way. That's missing the point, because that is not a way of preserving animal culture. The UNESCO Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity states that cultural diversity is as necessary for humankind as biodiversity is for nature. And Hal Whitehead has argued that if biodiversity in animal life is valuable and should be conserved, and culture and biology are inexorably intertwined, as we're finding it is, then culture and animal life is valuable and should be conserved as well. And so expanding these UN protections to non-human animals is something that I think we need to start thinking more seriously about as well. Okay, now finally, multiculturalism and cultural appropriation. So another thing we found once we realized that they're multi-species cultures and that these cultures are in proximity to one another, and sometimes even when they're separate cultures, they are learning from one another. Um, I think this really makes us think differently about what cultural appropriation might actually be, and that it's something that there's a quite a deep and ancient history of on this planet. We've been doing it forever, and everybody does it, and we've benefited from it, from sharing this kind of information with one another and freely giving it. So we know that members of different species gain information from one another. We've known this for a long time, that animals can listen to or eavesdrop on other species' alarm cries, for example, or food calls, and come together in multi-species groups to eat food or to run away at the same time. But there are also some really interesting examples of different species adopting one another's practices. I wish I had a picture or video of this. I haven't been able to find any, but Cricket Sands and her colleagues has found that the chimpanzees of the Gualago Triangle will beat their chests copying the gorillas who they live with. So this is a behavior not observed anywhere else, as far as I know, but just in this one community of chimpanzees who are learning this behavior from another species. But we also have lots of well-documented cases of non-human animals sharing their knowledge with humans. Um, so orangutans will chew up the Dracaena leaves, and they apply the lather to sore joints because it helps with arthritis. It's a kind of painkiller, anti-inflammatory. And this is something that the local Dayak people do as well. And they know, the story is they've learned this from the orangutans. There are also theories that the nests, like these nests made by weaver birds, might have inspired early humans to weave baskets, and that our early technologies of fiber use, making cordage, weaving nets to carry things, and ultimately making sophisticated baskets came from seeing what other animals were doing. And so the planet has, I think, a long history of multi-species, multiculturalism, and cultural appropriation because our societies are intrinsically intermingled. We might like to separate them and think that we are different and separate societies, but we're always overlapping with one another, and not just with societies of single species and not just with societies of our own species. And so returning to the red deer that we started with, right? These deer learned from us where to go and where not to go, and recognizing the kind of impacts we're having on non-human animals over generations. Because the fence has been gone for a long time, and the deer continue to follow this rule because our elders are following this rule. We have to think carefully also about the impacts we're having on other animals based on the way we decide to interact with the land. So I started with 3 questions about animal culture, and I'll end with 3 answers about animal culture. We ask what kinds of cultures are there. I think the answer is that they're rich societies with social norms and non-human animals. When we ask what kind of groups have cultures, the answer is that these groups go beyond single species and include multi-species societies. And when we ask what we can learn about flourishing with other animals, I think we can learn a lot. And just to get us started, we can learn to think differently about how to do conservation, also how to do welfare of captive animals when thinking about their societies and their social norms. We can think about preserving animal culture as a potential value alongside preserving human cultures. And we can learn to think differently about ownership of cultural knowledge and see cultural knowledge as something that perhaps we're creating together as agents on this planet. And so with that, I want to thank my collaborators on ongoing projects, my funders, my dog, who's now sitting in my basket I wove from technology I might have learned from birds, And I also just want to draw your attention to PAMBA. So those of you who don't know of it yet might be interested in the Philosophy of Animal Minds and Behavior Association that we launched a couple years ago. So thank you so much.